Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the second story from chapter 36 from Road to Latin textbook. Now this story is called De Bello Sabino. So we've been talking about Romulus and sort of the foundations of the city of Rome, and in the previous stories he's taken the Sabine women and now you're going to see that they want them back, right? So this is a continuation, not of the first story for chapter 36, which was all about numbers. This is continuing sort of the main story we were talking about in chapter 35. Before we dive too far into it though, like I always tell you in these videos, if you want more resources for the story, grammar notes, vocab, things like that, feel free to check out my website. You can find a bunch of stuff there that'll help you through. Particularly for the vocab, like I always tell you in these videos, you want to make sure that you have the vocab really under control before you start reading these stories. Being that this is the second story of the chapter, I'd assume that you probably have a pretty good grasp of the vocab. But still, before you go too far in, refresh your vocab. That's always step one, just because it's impossible to read through this if you don't know what the words mean. So always make sure you have the vocab down and feel good about it. The other thing is the grammar. Now, again, being the second story, you've probably already read through the grammar notes, I hope, and worked through cardinal and ordinal numbers. If you haven't, go work on it because, again, you'll see those numbers in the context of the stories. This one, not as much as the previous story, right? The first story in chapter 36 really gave you a heavy dose of how the numbers work. In this one, it's going to have a few numbers, but not as much. But either way, if you can get the grammar down, feel really comfortable with the notes, then when you read through these stories, you'll be able to see all that grammar in context. That's always a great place to start. The other advice I give you, try to read this aloud. I always tell you this, but if you can find a partner, someone to read this to, work on your speaking, your pronunciation, and then they can read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. You never want to shut those off. The other strategy I always advocate for is the read and reread method. So read through this story once, write down any problem areas you have, go look all of them up. I always tell you the vocab is easy. You just look it up in a dictionary. The grammar can be a little bit trickier, but still you could probably figure it out. Try to work through all your problem areas, then go back and keep rereading the story, right, over and over again until your list gets smaller and smaller, and eventually there is no list, right? So if you can read through this entire story without needing any vocab help, any grammar help, and you understand all of it or pretty close to all of it, that's how you know you're in a good place to move on. Okay, so if you haven't done that yet, go do it. Otherwise, watch the rest of the video and we'll work our way through it now. Okay, so the story starts like this. You have Sabini in Capitolium a Tarpeia ducti munitiones occupaverant, sed Romani ad Palatium fugerant. Okay, so the Sabines, and remember they're led by Tarpeia. So you have ducti a Tarpeia. You have the perfect passive participle here of ducti. So having been led by Tarpeia. Now we read in a previous chapter, this is part of the story of the sort of beginnings of the Sabine War. You have that betrayal of Tarpeia, who lets the Sabines in. So having been led by Tarpeia or onto, maybe is a better way to do it, the Capitolium, the Capitoline Hill, they occupaverant, they occupied, right, the munitiones, right, the defenses. So they get up there and they take over basically the hill, and they have the fortifications, maybe is a better way of doing munitiones, but they take over, occupied the fortifications. Okay, so they're up on the Capitoline Hill. But the Romani, the Romans, fugerant ad Palatium, so the Romans fled to the Palatine. Okay, so if you haven't done it yet, I'd encourage you to look at sort of a map of ancient Rome. There's one on my site for this chapter that would help you see it. But they're referring to the different hills of Rome, right? The 7 famous hills of Rome, and that's important because of what we're going to see in the next line to understand where these people are. So the Romans flee to the Palatine. The Sabines have the Capitoline Hill, and they're both kind of looking at each other from their hills, getting ready to fight again. Then you have inter duos montes fuit spatium aequum quod postea forum Romanum appellatum est. So inter duos montes means between the 2 hills. Now, again, montes, sometimes people say mountain. These are not mountains. You don't want to think of it that way. Hills is the better translation for it. So between the 2 hills, there was fuit, right? That's the verb esse. There was a spatium aequum, a level space. Okay, and it's a level space which postea, afterward, appellatum est. So here we have appellatum, which is a 4th principal part, but it's going with the verb to be, specifically the present tense form of esse. So this is perfect tense passive voice. So you're saying afterward it was called, right? But if you go with quote, you're saying which afterward was called the Forum Romanum, right? The Roman Forum. So again, it's easier to see on a map, but if you look at a map of Rome, the Capitoline, I believe, is in the northern part, northwest, and the Palatine is right in the middle. Between those 2 hills is the Forum, right? So the Forum is sort of the marketplace, the open area for trading, politics happen there, a bunch of different things. But the reason it's located there is back in the day when you had different peoples on the hills, that level ground in between was sort of like a safe space where everyone living on the hills could go down, they could trade with each other, interact, and then go back to their respective hills. So if you're wondering why the forum is where it is, that's the reason why. Okay, so they're talking about how, and again, the Capitoline and Palatine are next to each other. The Roman forum is right in the middle, and that's where they're going to fight in this story. So you have hic duo reges cum multis militibus prolium commisserunt. Okay, so hic means here, right? So here, the duo reges, the two kings, right? So Romulus and Tatius. So you have the Sabine king and then King Romulus. So the two kings, commisserunt prolium, they commenced battle, right? They started the battle with many soldiers, right? So you have there the multis militibus, right? Or just many soldiers. So they commenced battle, or began the battle, you could say, with many soldiers. Okay, then you keep going, and you have diu, right, for a long time. Diu atque acuter pugnatum est, sed victoria nutri regi data est. So for a long time, right, it was fought, pugnatum est, meaning the battle was fought very fiercely, acriter, right? And it was fought, the atque means and, so you could almost say like it was fought for a long time and fiercely, meaning the battle lasted a long time. It was a very violent battle. But victoria, victory, data est. Again, here, since you have est going with the fourth principal part, you're looking at perfect passive. So victory was given to neither king, nutri regi, right? So they're fighting it out, but nobody's actually getting a victory here. Then we keep going, and you have multa prolia facta sunt, multi milites caesi sunt. So multa prolia are many battles. So many battles facta sunt were fought. Okay, or were made, you might say, not fought. So many battles were made. Multi milites caesi sunt. Many soldiers caesi sunt were killed, right? Were slaughtered. So they keep fighting between the two hills. They're losing a lot of men, and nobody's winning at the end. Okay. Then you have tandem hostilius, dux Romanus interfictus est, et Romulus lapide vulneratus caecidit. Okay, so finally, or at last, Hostilius, he's a Roman leader, a dux Romanus, right? Sort of like a Roman general you want to think of. Interfectus est, he was killed. So the Romans lose this important leader, Hostilius. So he was killed. And Romulus, right? So King Romulus, caecidit, he fell. Okay, so here we have vulneratus, which is a fourth principal part by itself. That's the perfect passive participle. So the main verb is that Romulus fell in the battle. It doesn't mean he's dead. It just means he got kind of hurt, you're going to see here. So before that, you have vulneratus, the participle, having been wounded, lapide, by a stone. Okay, so you can imagine like a slinger or someone is chucking rocks at Romulus. They hit him and he goes down. So the leader of the one of the Roman generals, Hostilius, is actually dead, and then the king falls. Okay, so because of this, you have Romani regem vulneratum videntes perterriti sunt, et alii in aliam partem fugerant. So the Romans, videntes, seeing. So here we have that present participle. Remember, I told you in a previous chapter that it's easy to spot because of the nt ending. It's very distinct. So the Romans, seeing their wounded king, literally seeing their king having been wounded, vulneratum, but you could just say their wounded king. So when the Romans see Romulus on the ground, basically. So the Romans, seeing their wounded king, perterriti sunt, they were terrified, right, or extremely nervous, right? So they see him down, and they're all scared and terrified that he's been hit. Okay, and alii, some of them, fugerant, fled in aliam partem, in one direction or different directions. They run away. Okay, so some run away, having seen Romulus kind of fall to the ground like this. Okay, then you have brevi tempore autem Romulus surrexit. So in a short time, however, brevi tempore, Romulus surrexit, he gets up, right? He rose up. Think of words like resurrection, it has to do with getting up. So caecidit, he fell, surrexit, he got back up again. So the Romans see him on the ground and they assume he's dead. They start running away. But Romulus is still alive, obviously, right? We've heard of King Romulus. He doesn't die in this battle. Then you have fuga militum eratus acriter eos accusavit, sed ne unus quidem fugam intermissim. So this is talking about Romulus. He's eratus, so angry because of the fuga, because of the flight, militum, of his soldiers. So in other words, he sees all his soldiers running away, and Romulus is angry. He's eratus. So because of all this, or because of the flight of his soldiers, he's angry, and he accusavit, he accused. He starts yelling at them, right, accusing them, kind of calling them out for being cowards, right? Eos is them, so his soldiers, and he does this akriter fiercely. So he starts accusing them and calling them out, saying that they're all kind of lazy and cowards, basically. Okay. Then you have said, which means but ne unus quidem, right? So this is something I believe they gave you in the vocab, right? Not even one, or literally something like not a single one. The unus there is the one part, right? Ne is similar to known in this sense. So not even one intermissit fugam. Stopped the flight, right? So in other words, they're all running away. Romulus starts yelling at them, telling them they're cowards, but none of them actually stop, right? So not even, again, literally not even one stopped the flight. So they're all just keep running away. So then you have tum, right? Then Romulus, Joem patrum deorum invocans auxilium oravit. So then Romulus, he invocans, right? So there's your present participle, you can tell by the ns. So invoking Joem, Jove, which is Jupiter, right? The king of the gods. So invoking Jove or Jupiter, the patrum deorum, the father of the gods, right? He's the biggest one, the greatest one. Calling on Jupiter, he oravit auxilium. He begged for help, right? Oravit. So Romulus starts begging for help, right? Praying. He prayed for help. He might even say. So he starts begging for help, and he's calling upon or invoking Jupiter. All right. So that's who he prays to. Then you have virtus Romanorum verbis Romuli confirmata est et fugam intermiserant. So the virtus Romanorum, right, the virtue of the Romans, confirmata est. It was strengthened, right? So confirmata est just is perfect passive, right? So it was strengthened verbis. Remember, when you have passive verbs, you're looking for the ablative. The ablative here is verbis. So by the words of Romulus, Romuli. So because of his words, the spirit, the virtus, the virtue of the Roman soldiers is kind of strengthened up, and intermiserant, they stopped the fugam, the flight, right? So they finally stopped running away because Romulus has prayed to Jupiter, and it's kind of brought a boost to morale for all of his soldiers. Okay. Now we have a quote from Romulus and what he's actually praying. So he says, "Proelium comitite et hostes vincite milites, clama Romulus." So comitite means commence, right? So what you're looking at here are the commands, right? The imperatives. And the verbs, the imperatives end in te because they're plural and they're positive. So if you think back to commands, you can do a negative command, meaning you're telling someone to not do something, or a positive command, meaning you're telling them to do something. And in Latin, you have to distinguish negative and positive, and also singular and plural. So there's a difference between telling one person to do something and a bunch. The te is what makes this plural. So comitite means commence the proelium, the battle, right? And he's talking to the milites, his soldiers. So he says, commence the battle, and vincite, conquer the hostes, the enemy, milites, soldiers. So he starts yelling at him, saying, hey, get back to battle, get back to fighting, and defeat the enemy. Then he says, Jupiter nobis auxilium dabit. So Jupiter dabit will give auxilium, help, to us, right? There's your dative nobis. So he says, don't worry about it. Jupiter is going to help us out. Itaque Romani cum Sabinis iterum proelium comitunt. So, right, because of this, itaque, the Romans, they again comitunt proelium, they again commenced the battle cum Sabinis, with the Sabines. So the Romans had fled, now they've regrouped, they've kind of rallied around Romulus, who's not dead, and they start fighting the Sabines again. Then you have subito Sabinorum filiae quae a Romanis raptae sunt in proelium current. So here's the big major part of the battle. You have the Romans and the Sabines fighting it out, slaughtering each other, and this is the key part of the battle. Suddenly, the filiae Sabinorum, the daughters of the Sabines, right, the Sabine women, quae, who, raptae sunt, were taken, were captured, right, were snatched up by the Romans, which is what they did at the party, right? They steal all the women. So the daughters of the Sabines who had been, or who were rather, snatched or taken by the Romans, they current in proelium, they run into the battle. So you can see that in the picture I put for this video. That's the famous description of the Sabine women. They run into the middle of the battle, okay? You have neque tela neque vires hominum timet. So neither tela, weapons, nor, so remember neque is just neither nor. So neither weapons nor the vires hominum, the strength of the men, they feared, right? So they're not afraid of either of these things. So they're not They're not afraid of sort of these men fighting it out. They're not afraid of the weapons flying. And in some depictions, they actually show up with their babies, right? Which is what you're seeing in the picture. Okay. You have hoc et illoc corunt orantes finem belli. So hoc et illoc means this way and that. So they run into the middle of the battle, and now they're running this way and that, right? They run, current, right? They're running, and they're orantes. There's your present participle again, right? They're begging, right? It's a present participle, so begging for an finem belli, an end of the war. Okay, so you have to remember that this works because the Sabine women, they were originally the daughters of the Sabines, right? So it's their family on the Sabine side, but now they've been abducted and kind of married to the Romans. So you have this weird kind of between a rock and a hard place where the Sabine women have their new husbands in one sense and their fathers fighting each other, right? So that's why they're in this position to stop the battle and beg for an end to the battle. And you see things in the picture like the woman holding up her child, all these different things, but they are able to stop it. Okay. Then you have et Sabini et Romani verbis earum aducuntur. Okay, so both the Sabines and the Romans, right? So the et just means both and. So both the Sabines and the Romans, they were influenced, aducuntur, right? They were led or influenced by the verbis earum, by the words of them. And earum is feminine, it's talking about the Sabine women. So they're kind of moved or influenced by their words. So the women are running around begging them to stop, and they do actually stop. So you have itaque ambo reges finem belli faciunt. So both kings, they make a finem, they make an end of the war, right? So they make a peace treaty as the idea, and they actually stop the fighting. Then we have the last paragraph. You have pax inter eos constituta est. So peace between them, right, between the two people, was established. Constituta est, right? So it was established between them. Romani Sabinique, urbem communam habuerant. So the Romans and the Sabini, the Sabines. Remember, the que is the same thing as et. You can stick it on the end of the word; it would mean the same thing. It just means and. So they habuerant, they had or they held a common city, a communem urbem, meaning they shared the city. Okay. Then you have et Romulus et Tatius urbem communem quinque annos rexerunt. Okay. So both Romulus and Tatius, who's the Sabine king, they rexerunt, they ruled, right? It comes from regere, think of the word for king. They ruled the communal city, quinque annos. Here we have amount of time, years in the accusative. So it's duration of time, for 5 years. Quinque, there's I believe, our first number in this story. But again, quinque annos. So for 5 years, they ruled together. Then you have tandem, Tatius interfectus est, et Romulus solus regnavit. Right? So finally, or at last, Tatius interfectus est, he was killed, right? So he dies, he was killed, and Romulus solus, so Romulus alone, regnavit, ruled. So after a few years, it becomes just King Romulus, which is why a lot of people haven't heard of Tatius, the Sabine king, because it ends up just being Romulus. Okay? Then you end with this line. You have postea multa milia Romanorum Romulum deum et patrum urbis adoraverunt. So afterward, right, multa milia Romanorum, many thousands of Romans, okay? So many thousands of Romans, they adoraverunt, they worshipped Romulus as a deum et patrum urbis, as a god and the father of the city. Okay, so when Romulus eventually dies, the story is that he gets kind of elevated up into the heavens, right? He becomes a god, and they worship Romulus that way. So Romulus has a cult of being a god himself. He's one of these stories of someone who kind of morphs into a god, sort of like Hercules is kind of one way to think of it. Same idea. Okay, but everyone knows Romulus and the Romans for a very long time, right? They did worship their first king, King Romulus. So we see here in this story how the Sabine women's story ties in together, and how this war between the Sabines and the Romans finally ends, and you end up with a city that's a mix of both, right? The Sabines, the Romans, they have this shared city. They're kind of intermixing, right, with the Roman men and the Sabine women, and you get the population off and running, and the city's kind of off to what it becomes, okay? So hopefully that made some sense. And in terms of the grammar, there was a few numbers, but nothing crazy. This is more a story to advance the plot as opposed to the first story in 36. But hopefully it made some sense. You were able to read through it. If you have any questions at all, again, on a translation or anything, put it in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you. But otherwise, keep reading it, like I tell you, until you can get through this whole thing. And what you're able to do matches pretty close to what I did, and you're able to understand all of it without too much trouble. That's how you know you're in a good place and you're ready to move on. Good luck.